A good place to start is let's group together food in general and talk about how big a piece of the pie is the environment when it compares to things like fossil fuels. And then
Yeah.
we can split apart the plants and the animals and differentiate.
So let's take United States, for instance. Um, Farming in general, so livestock farming and other kinds of farming, would be about, I'm going to say, 10% of emissions. That leaves 90% for everything else: transport, energy, construction, all of those industries which are really based on fossil fuels. So, it makes agriculture look like a very small piece of the pie. It's a very similar ratio in the UK. So you'll have agriculture at about 10% and you'll have transport at 25%, right? Globally, it's 85% of all emissions are generated by things other than, say, animal agriculture. So agriculture itself globally is about 25%. And animal agriculture within that is about 14. Although that has been reduced of late. So the latest report coming out of the FAO says that globally livestock agriculture is responsible for 11% of all emissions. So people who are listening should be getting the picture really that 11%, what's the other 89? What are we doing about that? And even when you talk about methane, for instance, methane has become associated. Methane is one of the greenhouse gases. Just in case I don't want to be too simplistic, but in case people aren't aware, when we talk about carbon emissions targets, we're talking about something called CO2 equivalents, which is made up of methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon, and they're sort of balanced out to be an equivalent rating. So methane is one of those gases, and methane is really associated with cattle. I mean, you probably had this experience where people almost think that cattle are the only things that create methane, and therefore we must get rid of the cows. In fact, cows only generate 15% of the methane that's generated in the world. A lot of the sources are natural sources: wetlands, lakes, rivers, oceans. They are things like landfills, a big source of methane. Industry creates methane. So if we're talking about getting rid of methane, we have a much bigger job on our hands than simply culling the cows or even changing the way we farm the cows. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't change the way we farm the cows, because we can do many things to improve that cycling that we were talking about earlier. We can improve the way animals around the world are farmed so that that cycle of getting the carbon back into the ground and reducing and counteracting the methane in that way, we can improve that, and we should. But that's a very different thing from demonizing the livestock and saying that they're the sole contributors of methane to the environment.
Okay, we can quickly see there's a lot of nuance to this.
A lot.
But it sounds like when it comes to the environmental impact, is it 11% for animal agriculture? The latest stat?
Globally.
Globally.
That was just out of GLEAM, which is an FAO department. Yeah.
Okay, let's compare now animal agriculture versus plant. I want to make sure I fully understand the nuance here.
I don't have the latest global number for animal versus plant. I know that in the UK, for instance, it will be about 7% to livestock animals, and I'm going to say 4.5 to 5% for plants. So in the US, it's different. In the US, the animals agriculture is responsible for less than half of all of agriculture. So you'll get more in the plant-based and in the plant agriculture.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So
So,
every country is different. Every country is different because of the way they farm, because of what it is they farm, and because of the efficiency with which they farm, and also because of the structure of their economy. So in a lot of third world countries, developing countries, animal agriculture appears to be a huge amount of their emissions because they hardly have any other emissions, right? That's it. They don't contribute very much. In places like the UK and the US, we're very, very industrialized countries. We have a lot of industry. Industry is our primary problem.
all right. Well, the point I'm trying to get to and distill down, because the big argument from vegans is going to be that our food has less emissions, carbon, CO2 emissions. If practices are done to the best capability, how can we compare that? And of course, there's a lot of nuance. What animals, what crops, and again, what part of the world? But what I want to make sure we hammer home in this part of the conversation is if things are done to a certain standard when it comes to animals and plants, and we can use the US as an example, can we get carbon emissions down to zero for both, like with certain practices?
Whether
Like,
we,
can animal producing animal food versus plant done properly, quote unquote, can we get the animal emissions to the same level as plants or even better?
I believe we can. There are farmers who believe that we can. So there are farms in the US and it's less well documented in the UK, but there are those farms where they've proven that they can be carbon neutral on their farm. So White Oak Pastures is quite a famous study. It was conducted with Will Harris and his farm in Georgia, and they did a 20-year-long study, and at the end they were looking at whether there was carbon neutrality for his beef, and found that it was actually carbon negative the way it was produced because it did more for capturing carbon than it did for emitting methane. So individual farmers will say that. We have evidence to that effect. There are a number of studies which are captured by an organization called Soil for Climate. They amass a lot of studies about this carbon neutrality around the world on different farms. What is happening, though, is that people who produce the models which influence government and influence the media and therefore influence the debate, they tend to look at things at a very much higher level. They don't account for the sequestration. They don't believe it. They say it doesn't really happen, or it can only happen up to a certain saturation point. And so they attribute many more emissions to animal agriculture than your average farmer would do. And we've had this problem with a particular study. I don't want to get too geeky with study names or anything, but this is a really important study by Poor and Nemecek, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And it claimed to look at all kinds of foods all around the world, 135,000 farms, and conclude that meat was producing, 100 kilos of carbon per kilo of product, whereas something like beans would be, 0.2 of a kilo or something like that. So there was a massive jamming of animal foods and red meat in particular, by this study. That study has gone on to be used many, many times in other studies. So you get this buildup of evidence, right? And it's very hard to combat that. But when you look at the data in the Poor and Nemecek study, it overstates the acknowledged carbon cost of British beef by 3 times. it probably does that for, and that's the study I have seen dissecting that. It probably does that for every other country as well, because it's taking the worst offenders. It's not looking at the Will Harrises of the world, their farms. It's looking at the worst offenders and taking the numbers from those and using that for a global study. And that's why global studies say one thing, farmers say another, and we really need to start looking at the commonality between those things. And I think that policymakers need to pay a lot more attention to what the farmers are saying and that on the ground evidence about what's possible to achieve.
I'm just picturing a vegan listening in and entering this part of the conversation. I want to make sure, again, we're clear on this. We'll use best case scenario. And the common argument you're going to hear is that if you include animal products in your diet, you're having a greater environmental impact. We've already clearly stated the health benefits of including animals, but when it comes to environment, can we get a better result or at least neutral when it comes to farmers that are farming animals versus plants? Do you get what I'm saying? I want to be clear on when we leave this part that there is no environmental, if this is true, benefit to only farming plants.
Well, there is an environmental benefit. Let's say there may be an environmental benefit if you're talking about only carbon. Now, there was a study again in the US that came out 2016, which did a study of what would happen to US emissions if all animal foods were removed from the diet for all Americans. And they concluded that, yes, emissions would go down by about 2.5%. Okay. That's not nothing, but it's not very much. And they concluded also that in the process of achieving those lower emissions, we would see many nutrient deficiencies, right? So we'd be missing certain amino acids, certain vitamins, and that would be across the population. So you have to factor that into this carbon question. So then the next step should be, okay, so if we don't want those nutrient deficiencies, we'd have to grow more of those crops to meet those, if we even could, because there's some nutrients you can't even get, right? Let's say we grew more of those crops, took up more land to grow the crops. You can pretty soon see that the 2.5% gain in emissions would be lost by the growing of more crops to meet those nutrient deficiencies. Am I being at all clear?
No, this is nuanced, and you're explaining it very well, and this is important. So if we make more plants, grow more plants to fill in the nutritional void of taking away animals, and then we start comparing carbon, we're going to be even higher. Then
we may be higher, we may be equal. I don't know. I don't know what but the gap, 2.5% reduction that we would have achieved, it would easily be lost by the need to produce these other forms of nutrients. Something else to factor in, we shouldn't only be thinking about carbon, or CO2, I should say. We should also be thinking about biodiversity, about soil health. Those are other elements of the environment that we need to be protecting. What would happen to soil health if animals were removed from the land and we were using only nitrogen fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, to produce monocrops in enough quantity to feed people? What happens to the soil then? It gets more depleted than it already is, right?
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going there next. So take that story even further. What happens down the line over generations?
Well, I think what happens is, David Montgomery writes about civilizations that have been lost, because the minute you lose your soil, you lose life, you lose your civilization. And this has happened throughout history. We would be in danger of that happening again if we continue to overuse chemical fertilizers on our land without the replenishment that comes from regenerative forms of agriculture and from animals on the land. You need those animals, you need them. The other thing is diversity, biodiversity. How do you get that if you're growing crops with chemical inputs across large swathes of the land in order to feed people because you don't have any protein from animal sources? How do you get biodiversity? You don't, because monocrop farming is completely antithetical to biodiversity. You're killing a lot of small animals, the birds, the bees, because of the way those products are farmed. So for me, the only way forward is a kind of is an approach to agriculture which is holistic, which people call agroecology. People call it regenerative agriculture. There are a number of references. All of them are nuanced, a little bit different. But what they mean is looking at the ecosystem as a whole and factoring in how all those parts work together. And animals are an essential part of how that ecosystems must work.
Before we leave this and go into ethics, let's give you a hypothetical situation here. And say you're at a party, you're feeling a little bit feisty, and a vegan comes up to you and says, I am on this diet for environmental reasons. And again, you've given a ton of nuance, but what would your quick answer be to why that point specifically doesn't make sense?
I'm not very good at this dinner party, cocktail party chat. I've got to tell you, I can very rarely come up with the one sentence when it comes to environmental stuff. And I'm thinking out loud here.
But do they stand a chance with that argument? Again, we've talked about the fact that if you grew only plants, you'd bring the carbon emissions up. But I just want to make sure we're clear on this part. If somebody is using this as their sole reason of not eating animals, why they need to consider otherwise?
I think that what I would probably do is I would ask them, okay, what is their primary reason for thinking that animal agriculture is bad for the environment? They would most likely come back and say, the methane, right? Because that's what people do. And I would tell them the story of methane then. And I would say all the ways that methane from cattle, and this is not one sentence, but I might do it in 5 sentences, all the ways that methane from cattle is vastly exaggerated. And you and I haven't even talked about all the ways, but we've talked about, the 11% versus the 89%. But we haven't talked about the fact that the way the metrics that are used favor industry and condemn animal agriculture. There's a metric called GWP star or GWP 100. And at the moment, GWP 100 is being used, and it overstates the emissions from cattle by about 3 to 4 times. It overstates the warming effect. So there are a number of ways in which methane is exaggerated. And then I would talk about the fact that animals that the land cannot survive without animals on it. And we would end up with desertified land that is dry and brittle, that has no nutrients in it, because the animals are essential for keeping that land, keeping the moisture in the soil, keeping the nutrients in the soil, keeping the carbon in the soil. Now, if that person's still standing next to me, I'd maybe go get them another drink and take them and give them an hour. But they've probably gone by now.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
The fact that they have these 3 legs, the health, the environment, and ethics, makes for this, what I sometimes refer to that as a 3-legged stool. It's pretty hard to kick over a 3-legged stool. If you take one of those legs out, you can kick it over pretty quickly. But the